Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, on the record or off the record?
If they don't tell me something's off the record, then it's fair game.
That is just one of the questions surrounding the story of General Stanley McChrystal, the Mexican drug wars, and the new blog that goes where the mainstream media do not, putting a lot of distance between themselves and the story. Journalists working in exile. And a Nobel Prize-winning power trio. Our web video of the week. It is difficult to know just where to start with the story of the demise of American military commander Stanley McChrystal, with what he said about his boss and commander-in-chief, President Obama, with the fact that he was taken down not by the enemy, but by a journalist, or that it wasn't a New York Times, Washington Post, or CNN story, but rather the work of Rolling Stone, a counterculture magazine that does quality journalism but is much better known for its music reviews than for its political reporting. Here at The Listening Post, we're going to focus, as we always do, on the media angle, on some of the journalistic questions that this story has thrown up. Like, how did Rolling Stone writer Michael Hastings manage to land a story that other war reporters could not? And what does that and the reaction of other journalists say about the way that the mainstream U.S. media cover the American military? Our starting point this week is Afghanistan, a profile in Iraq magazine, and the repercussions that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon and the White House.
America's top commander in Afghanistan and members of his staff went rogue in a Rolling Stone article.
In fly-on-the-wall journalism, you're there to capture exactly those kinds of moments.
Michael Hastings went out, he built a source, he got information, and he reported it to his audience.
What I was focusing on was trying to write the best story that I could to bring attention to the war in Afghanistan.
It's a long article, it's worth reading. Everything in the article rang true to me. Very true, very accurate.
What Michael Hastings and Rolling Stone got with this piece that has turned the war upside down is a scoop.
An old-fashioned scoop. Cause for celebration among the U.S. journalistic community? Hardly.
Does Rolling Stone magazine usually get this kind of access?
It was crazy this guy had that much access.
How did this reporter get inside the inner circle of trust? And did he violate the trust?
I think it was surprising how jealous the media behaved about Michael Hastings' story. He was a good reporter who went out and got a solid story that made a difference. They should have taken that as a moment of pride, but it seemed as though they were taking it as a moment of professional jealousy, frankly.
Why would the general allow a guy like that access to him and his staff?
And the reason there seems to be such hostility is because there's a sense in the Washington media and the establishment press corps that if you have the choice to avoid embarrassing or otherwise harming somebody in power, that it's the responsibility of the reporter to think about how to protect the powerful.
This is Helmand Province, and
the U.S. media are asking more and more questions about Afghanistan, on the military strategy, on whether the war is even worth fighting. But before Rolling Stone published the criticisms by McChrystal and his staff of President Obama and his administration, the general had enjoyed plenty of positive personal coverage.
According to those who have served with him, a one-of-a-kind commander.
If there is one word that is used to describe Stan McChrystal most often, it is discipline.
He eats one meal a day. In another life, he could have been a monk.
Much of that, though, came from beat reporters, journalists who cover the military and want to keep covering the military.
The dynamic that we see here is extremely common, by no means unique to the military or to Afghanistan. Political reporters are so desperate, so eager for access to high-level political officials that they perpetually cover them in a way that's very flattering in order to ensure access. There's even a term that Washington reporters have. It's called beat sweeteners. And the idea is that when you first cover a beat, you write a very flattering profile of an official in order to ingratiate yourself with him or her and to ensure access. The problem is that the beat sweetening never ends.
Then there's the question of off the record versus on the record. Michael Hastings' article included plenty of salty language and off-colored jokes, the kind of things that few high-ranking officials would willingly share with a reporter.
Granted access to
Jamie McIntyre covered the Pentagon for CNN and is familiar with the U.S. military's rules of journalistic engagement.
Off the record means you can witness things and know them, and they can factor into your reporting, but you can't actually quote them. So when I think the journalistic community in Washington read the account, the immediate thing that struck most people was, wow, how did he get them to put all that stuff on the record? And now it turns out there's a little bit of a dispute about whether or not those things were supposed to be on the record.
Hastings talked about that on CNN.
For me, when I go in to write a profile and no ground rules are laid down, and I'm there to write an on-the-record profile and cover readings while in the room, then that means it's on the record. I mean, it's not much of a mystery. If someone tells me something's off the record, I don't print it. If they don't tell me something's off the record, then it's fair game.
What was on the record or off the record is something that only the reporter and the general know for certain. However, that did not stop Lara Logan, CBS News' chief foreign affairs correspondent and veteran military reporter, from going after her journalistic colleague.
Michael Hastings, if you believe him, says that there were no ground rules laid out. And I mean, that just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
She was furious at Michael Hastings for having ruined journalism for her and people like her, because now the military won't trust journalists any longer.
That is exactly the kind of damaging type of attitude that makes it difficult for reporters who are genuine about what they do.
She sounded exactly like a family member of General McChrystal or his PR hack. She even at one point lashed out and said,
I mean, Michael Hastings has never served his country the way McChrystal has.
And you can really see the extraordinary identification that these reporters come to have with the people whom they cover.
Michael Hastings went out and broke news. He made a difference. He, quite frankly, changed the course of history in some senses because he didn't feel constrained by the beat reporters' rules. And if beat reporters are feeling constrained, then there might be something wrong with the system.
But almost lost in the coverage of the McChrystal story as reporters focused on journalistic ground rules and the fall of the general was the larger point of the article that Hastings wrote and Rolling Stone published.
The really important journalistic work that Michael Hastings did was that he, in a very textured way, an in-depth way, showed the real deep doubts that U.S. commanders have about the possibility of success in Afghanistan. Had it not been for those anecdotes that ended up getting McChrystal fired, the piece would have been seen much more as about the failings of the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan, how even the people inside McChrystal's inner circle do not have confidence that this U.S. strategy is really going to work.
Instead, attention has swung to the new general in charge of the war.
Named America's best-known active-duty General David Petraeus.
A significant advantage General Petraeus brings is his political skill and influence.
He is America's last best hope to win the war in Afghanistan.
David Petraeus is also known to be a savvy media operator.
Trying to get this as right as we can.
If he has any doubts about the strategy in Afghanistan, he's smart enough to keep them to himself, or at the very least keep them well and truly off the record. And here's how our Global Village voices see the reporting of and the reaction to the McChrystal story.
What I don't understand about the McChrystal situation is, how does somebody get to be that high up in the military without any understanding of public relations or what a journalist does or will do? I mean, we live in a democracy, so the military and the media are still going to have to communicate. I guess it's just going to be a lesson to future generals.
Rolling Stone's decision to have Michael Hastings spend a lot of time with General McChrystal and his aides is what made the story as powerful and influential as it was. The big lesson for journalism here is that despite the 24-hour news cycle that's driven so much by sound bites, it's still valuable for journalists to get out there and do long-term, in-depth reporting.
The beat reporters may very well have been holding back on such things, thinking that they were not particularly important, and that the access that they were given was necessary to break more important stories later on. They weren't entirely wrong, but what Rolling Stone accomplished demonstrated that it's important that we also have independent outside voices reporting on these important issues.
Time now for some Listening Post news bites. Back in March, when Google pulled out of China for what it called security and censorship reasons, it came up with an alternative for its customers on the Chinese mainland. It redirected them to Google servers based in Hong Kong. That's proving to be no solution. The company's chief lawyer, David Drummond, has blogged that the government in Beijing will reject Google's license renewal application, meaning the company would have to shut down its Chinese operation entirely. Google's proposing a compromise that would allow its users to get some services, those that require no filtering, such as translation and music searches. That would allow Google to maintain a foothold in the huge Chinese search market, albeit with a fraction of the traffic. A new blog is filling the void left by the widely silenced, often self-censored news media in Mexico. It's called Blog del Narco. It's posting news on the drug trade that the mainstream media in Mexico are shying away from. Here's an example, a video showing the final moments of a member of a drug cartel being tormented by his captor. The blog also shows its readers how to contact police anonymously, how to set up email accounts using aliases. They even have a live Twitter feed where Mexicans can tweet details of shootings in their area. The people behind the site also operate anonymously, and who can blame them? The Mexican drug cartels are violent. Some are allegedly backed by corrupt government officials and police. Over the past 10 years, 62 journalists have been killed in Mexico. Another 11 are missing and presumed dead. French President Nicolas Sarkozy has apparently lost a battle over the control of a leading newspaper there, Le Monde. Le Monde was put up for sale earlier this year. Like many newspapers, it's going through some serious financial difficulties. A group of investors considered to be close to the opposition Socialist Party indicated that they were ready to pump up to $142 million into the paper. Then, according to various published reports, President Sarkozy personally intervened, as he is wont to do in French media matters. He backed another group of investors who would be more kindly disposed to his government. But the president's plan was rejected by 90% of Le Monde journalists, who have a big say in this, because up until now the paper has been owned and operated by its staff. The sale has now been approved for the initial investors, who have promised to leave the paper with full editorial independence. It's been 4 years since an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, was taken prisoner by Hamas, and Hamas has released an animated video to coincide with that anniversary. It's the second time that Hamas has done this. The video depicts the cross-border raid in which the soldier was captured, his tank exploding, and a wounded Shalit being held in an oversized hand. Eventually, the video shows the date in 2006 of the capture, and a sentence reading, "The illusion is shattering." Shalit's imprisonment is a big issue in Israel. On the date of the anniversary, Israelis started an 11-day protest march from northern Israel all the way to Jerusalem. They want their government to free Shalit by agreeing to a prisoner exchange. Although there have been negotiations through outside mediators, they've gone nowhere, reportedly because the Palestinians want hundreds of prisoners held by Israel freed in return for Shalit. We're back after the break with a piece on journalists who have been chased out of their countries but still covering their countries. Welcome back. Earlier on this program, we talked about Mexico, which is one of those countries that outside journalists often drop into. Parachuting, it's called, because being based there can be dangerous. Often we'll see the work of parachuted journalists on our screens, or we read their bylines. But what we don't often hear about is the number of local journalists who are forced to escape from those very places, fearing for their safety, their freedom, sometimes fearing for their lives. The media watchdog group Reporters Without Borders says that journalists are now fleeing countries like Mexico, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar at a rate of about 6 per month. They're on the run from either criminals, politicians, or police. However, some of those reporters do manage to stay in the business and stay on the story. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on journalists living in exile, still reporting on their homelands from distant lands.
Aid groups say they are extremely worried about what they're calling the nightmare situation of civilians trapped in the fierce fighting in northern Sri Lanka.
Daring to question the Sri Lankan government or the military can be deadly.
I honestly didn't want to leave. Despite all the threats, I wanted to stay there. I thought I could escape to the hills and right from there. But this government was getting a bit heavy-handed with journalists.
Sri Lankan journalist Pearl Devanayagan escaped to Britain in 2001. Her coverage of the civil war in North Sri Lanka had put her on the radar of a government that was growing increasingly intolerant of inconvenient reportage.
For anyone who disagrees with official opinion, these are dangerous times.
A year after Pearl's escape, Lance Guma, a Zimbabwean journalist, had to leave his country for much the same reasons.
The reasons that motivated my leaving were mainly centered around my safety and, of course, just the general environment for journalists at the time. It was not really safe for me to continue being there, and basically I made the decision to leave.
For news media, crossing swords with the authorities is an occupational hazard.
Israel has kept Gaza completely closed to journalists. The Islamic Republic keeps such a tight grip on any kind of dissent.
When we spoke to Abel Ugba, chairman of the UK-based Exiled Journalists network, he said that the pattern of media intolerance is changing.
In the past, you could almost predict that people running from their country because of their profession were from a military dictatorship. But these days, you find journalists escaping countries which for many years have civilian democratic government. And yet, the climate to press freedom, it's hostile, and many of them are finding it impossible to practice their profession the way they would want to do it.
The military government of Myanmar is notorious for its harsh line against independent journalists, and a group of activists escaped to Norway in the late 80s and began broadcasting back into their country in 1992 as the democratic voice of Burma.
It is impossible to broadcast from inside Burma, so we are outside of the country, broadcasting both shortwave radio and then satellite television that can reach millions of people in the country. More people need more independent and biased news to make decisions for their own life or to participate in politics in a meaningful way. Now government is controlling politics by controlling the media. If they lose control over the media, they lose their power.
And it would seem that DVB's strategy has worked. Its satellite TV broadcasts were crucial during the 2007 uprisings in Myanmar. The footage they put out informed the world and those back at home. But getting the pictures out of a country where journalists are prime targets for the authorities was not easy.
We have about 35 journalists inside Burma filming for us, sending reports for us on a daily basis. But of course, they all are underground. They can never be identified as a journalist working for us.
In SW Radio, the Zimbabwean broadcaster based outside London,
Newsreel by Zimbabweans for Zimbabweans.
There's similar concern for those working on the ground back at home.
Well, they face enormous pressure. Even when you have the current coalition government, our correspondents do not use their real names. We use pseudonyms throughout. We've been doing that for over 6 years.
The risk is heightened because of the impact exiled media outlets like DVB and SW Radio have on events back at home. In 2008, Zimbabwe held presidential elections, and media inside the country were hamstrung in what they could report. Broadcasting from thousands of miles away, SW Radio had no reason to fear the Zimbabwean authorities, and their coverage of the election campaign might have been a factor in the institution of the new coalition government.
We mainly broadcast to people in the rural areas, and even in our content, we always try and make them as simple as possible for the ordinary person to understand. And they were able to use this to make their choices at the parliamentary and presidential elections last year. And I think this is why we were particularly a nuisance and ended up being targeted by the government.
Lance Guma's work with SW Radio Africa is not just a means of livelihood. Here in the UK, he's thousands of miles away from home, and his work helps give him a sense of purpose. But his is a rare case. For most journalists in exile, leaving their country also means leaving their profession.
I think the sad reality is that many qualified, highly qualified, intelligent journalists find that they cannot go back to their profession. They cannot restart their profession. Take the case of Per. She's been here for quite a number of years. She's very articulate. She is very active, and she was a very senior journalist before she left Sri Lanka. But here, she's not been able to make her way back into the profession. And her story is not an isolated one.
Living outside Sri Lanka has pushed her into a professional dead end. And given the controversial reports she produced as a journalist there's little hope she can go back.
This is a really bizarre government. There's no rationale behind its actions. They virtually said, don't criticize the government's efforts.
So you wouldn't go back?
I can't. I don't think I can pass the airport.
My heart says yes. I miss my family, I miss my friends, I miss everything about home. But unfortunately, my brain has to engage and intervene, and facts on the ground do not suggest that the current dispensation is willing to embrace media freedom.
We are working for the day we can go back with dignity, meaning there is space for democracy, there is space for free media, so that we can go back. We are really working hard for that day.
More Global Village Voices now on Journalists in Exile.
The democratic voice of Burma and shortwave radio Africa deserve high credit for influences in Burma and Zimbabwe, all while reporting from thousands of miles away. Though the ultimate goal of democracy has not yet been achieved in either Burma or Zimbabwe, the perseverance of exiled journalists has proven to be very persuasive.
Being in close proximity to Zimbabwe, it has been quite shocking and instructive in many ways and levels to watch how Mugabe and his thugs have systematically dismantled opposition journalism in Zimbabwe simply by killing off the journalists or by just bombing and trashing the media houses. In a sense, the Zimbabwean journalists are actually quite lucky because they have fled to South Africa and to the UK, where because of historical and cultural reasons they do have access to the BBC or they're able to write in The Guardian. I don't think a Somalian journalist working as a taxi driver in New York has the same kind of opportunities.
Finally, when we choose our web videos of the week, we usually try to pick one that's related to something that's happening in the news. As reporters say, we try to find a peg, something to hang it on. We failed to do that this week. We've chosen something that's apropos of nothing remotely newsworthy. We just like the video. How somebody came up with the idea of impersonating 3 past winners of the Nobel Peace Prize, one of whom is no longer with us, and equipping them with musical instruments is beyond us. But like many things on the net, for some reason, it works. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Okay, base. Bit more, Nelson. Bit harder, sir. Cool. Beautiful. All right, got it. D Lama.